Now ask someone to name a British sports car and the chances are they would say Lotus. Ever since the heady days of Jim Clark and Ayrton Senna storming to numerous Grand Prix victories, they've held a special place in the heart of many. But they used to be the preserve of the rich, not anymore with this Elise. Today in our buyer's guide we're going to show you how to go about buying a used Lotus.
At the time of its launch in 1996, the Elise was seen by many as the saviour of Lotus. Sales were down and their image was flagging. Their model range consisted only of the capable but ultimately outdated Esprit. Launched to worldwide acclaim, the Elise offered a back-to-basics sports car experience that made it an immediate cult icon. Combining stunning good looks, reliability and of course an incredible driving experience, it was not long before people were calling it the true successor to the Lotus 7 and the saviour of Lotus.
Now, like a lot of people, I like to think I know a thing or two about most cars, but a Lotus isn't most cars. So to help you avoid some of the pitfalls when buying a used Lotus, we're off to Christopher Neal, an independent Lotus specialist in Northwich, Cheshire, to get some advice.
Steve, I want to start talking about, first of all, the marque Lotus. It's got enduring appeal, hasn't it?
It certainly has, from many years of racing history, under Colin Chapman's guidance, many interesting cars through the 80s, culminating in the Elise in the 1990s. It's opened up a whole new era of Lotus.
It's given sort of Lotus a new lease of life, hasn't it?
It certainly has, yes. It's brought Lotus ownership to the masses, really. The Elise is much more affordable than perhaps previous Lotuses have been.
Do you think that's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing for Lotus? Because I always remember when Porsche brought out a cheaper car, people said, oh, it's it's kind of doing down the mark, but it's not so with the Elise.
Oh, certainly not. No. It's as I say, it's brought Lotus ownership to the masses in a way that couldn't have imagined perhaps 10 years ago. You'd no longer have to be a wealthy man to run a Lotus.
Now, you're an independent Lotus specialist here at Christopher Neal. How much of your business is Elise's and how much is Elan's and the other Lotus cars?
Recently it's become 90% Elise. We still have the occasional Esprit, Lotus Elan when we can find nice examples.
The Elise is powered by Rover's 1.8 K-series engine which produces 120 brake horsepower. Not a lot, you may think, but when the whole package weighs in at just over 700 kilograms, the car's power-to-weight ratio puts it on a par with far more powerful and expensive machinery. Performance figures for the base 1.8 puts the 0 to 60 time at around 5.5 seconds and a top speed of 125.
If someone was buying a second-hand Elise, first of all, would you recommend that they came to a specialist such as yourself, or if they know what they're doing, can they go and buy them independently?
You can buy them independently, and there's very few pitfalls with the Elise. I would recommend buying from a dealer just for peace of mind, to know you've got a warranty to fall back on.
What are the pitfalls? You say there aren't many, but there must be some. What should a second-hand buyer be looking for?
Some of the cars are used for track days, and then they have a hard life, particularly hard on the brakes and suspension. You very often find that perhaps a 3 or 4 year old one will need brake discs, shock absorbers, that sort of thing. Not particularly expensive, but they do need taken into account.
In terms of the cost of a second-hand car, what should we be looking at? Obviously there are many different models, but a kind of ballpark figure starting for, how much can you get at second-hand Elise for?
Elises start from around the £15,000 mark for one of the first 96, 97 models. And typically they haven't done a huge mileage. A lot of them are used as second cars, perhaps have a fairly low mileage. Don't be frightened of a car with sort of 30, 40,000 miles on. And as I say, they start at 15, a little bit more. You start spending 18, 19,000 and you can get an example like this. Very low mileage, been used as a second car, very good spec, been looked after.
In 2000, Lotus launched its second generation Elise. The new model addressed one of the major criticisms of the original, its looks. With a lower ride height and far more aggressive styling, the new Elise now looked as good as it handled. The new Elise is available in 3 different flavours, the standard 1.8 litre edition, the Sport 135 model and the 111S, which boasts 143 brake horsepower.
Are there any hidden costs that we should be aware of? You mentioned the suspension and the brakes, you know, they need to be looked at before you buy a car, but is there anything substantial that when a car is X number of years old it needs certain things doing to it?
No, not at all. They're relatively vice-free. Tyres, you know, they're probably a little bit more than you'd pay for the average car, but not significantly so. In general, mechanicals of them are very robust. It's the MGF engine and transmission. The interior is real minimalist, so there's very little trim to wear. There's no power steering, there's no servo brakes, basically because it doesn't need any of these things.
Due to the Elise's huge popularity, cheap used examples are hard to find, and they can often fetch a higher price than newer models. Prices for new models start at around £23,000, but we found a 1998 model with only 6,500 miles on, still valued privately at £20,000.
As you say that a lot of people who come in to see your cars here are using them as a second car, who is your typical customer for an Elise?
If there were a typical customer, it would probably be the company car driver who has his BMW, whatever, for use in the week, and the Lotus Elise tends to sit in his garage. It's there for weekend use, track days, that sort of thing.
Now, a new Elise starts at about sort of £24,000–25,000, and yet you've got second-hand models here that are anything up to sort of £26,000–27,000. What are the major differences? You know, would you perhaps recommend that people go for a new car or a really good second-hand model?
Well, if you're spending top end of the 20s, then obviously it makes a temptation to buy a new car, but you can get a really good spec used one, perhaps 12 months old, with very little mileage for in the lower 20s, which does represent very good value.
Well, if I had anything up to the late 20s, I'd have obviously bought one by now. I'm afraid I'm just going to have a test drive.
Now, as with any car, when you come to buy it, you have to make a list of pros and cons. And with this Lotus, each list is very, very long. In terms of the pros, you get a fantastic car that is brilliant to drive. It's so precise and compact, only it feels every divot in the road. You feel, see, that was a worm, and yet it goes through the whole car. But what it does is flatters you into thinking you're a great driver. And the sports exhaust that's on this car is an absolutely brilliant note. However, on the downside, it's very compact. I mean, you know, you have to be very good friends with your passenger, and if you're not at the start, you will be by the end. And it's slightly pricey. 18.5 grand gets you this couple of years old model. But what you do get is one of the best drives you will ever experience in a sports car. In terms of value for money, you have to decide whether £18,000 is a reasonable amount to pay for what isn't an everyday car. It is a weekend joy car, or it's a car for two very small people. As for luggage space, there isn't any, but let's face it, if you're going shopping in this, you want to get a life. Now, what the Elise demonstrates brilliantly well is that you don't need a huge amount of brake horsepower and litre capacity under the bonnet to have huge amounts of fun. This is only an 1800 MGF Rover engine, and it only generates 111 brake horsepower. But that's all you need. You can get up-rated Elises with 120, 130 brake horsepower, but believe me, that's bags enough. It's an affordable British sports car, and if that's your bag, then I'd go for it. 18 grand does sound like a lot of money though. You decide. There we go, the buyer's guide to buying a Lotus Elise. What could be easier?